I'm Errol Lewis of the Daily News, sitting in for Brian Lehrer. Earlier this month, the city announced it was bringing free wireless internet to major parks throughout the 5 boroughs. And while private companies are backing the project, it was heralded as a much-needed public service. But just how much of a public service is it when many low-income neighborhoods don't even have the laptops you need to get online? And with rumblings of Wi-Fi coming to the entire city, how much will people in these neighborhoods stand to benefit? We thought we'd use this time to look at the digital divide that still exists in New York. That's the gap between the number of people with access to computers and the internet and those without. One of my next guests says it's not the digital divide we need to worry about, but a content divide between minorities and everyone else. So with me now to talk about this and what the city can do about it are Walter Fields of the Community Service Society of New York, an advocacy group that works on poverty issues, and Andrew Rasiej, an internet entrepreneur who ran for public advocate last year on a ticket that included a proposal to bring Wi-Fi to the city. Walter and Andrew, welcome back to WNYC.
Good to see you. Thank you.
Walter, what's the difference between the digital divide and the content divide that you're talking about?
Well, I never really believed in the notion of a digital divide. I think that much of that was based upon the issue of computer penetration in households. But if we're really going to talk about access to the internet, and if you look at the stats over the last year, between 2005 and 2006, broadband penetration in black households increased 121%. I think what we're beginning to see is whether or not there is relevant content on the web that will attract certain segments of the population. So even though certain households may not have computers in the household, that may not be the device that they access the internet. We're beginning to look at more wireless use, more use on wireless cell phones and other devices. The question becomes whether or not those platforms become meaningful ways to transmit information that populations will find useful.
When you say find useful, what do you mean? What's missing?
Well, I think what's missing is culturally relevant information. I think news and public affairs information cater to certain segments of the population. In many ways, it mimics what we see on network television, where you have a very narrow perspective presented to audiences. So you don't have the diversity of points of view oftentimes, even on the web, that you do on television. So, for instance, how many black public affairs news websites can you mention?
Well, I know of a few, actually, and I was going to ask you about that.
Name them.
Well, blackcommentator.com.
Well, Black Commentator is an opinion site, and I know the guys who run them. I love them well. I ran a site for 2.5 years that's getting ready to relaunch, the NorthstarNetwork.com. But I can tell you there's only a handful of us, and we all know each other, who actually ran full-fledged websites with public affairs and news information. So I think that there is a tremendous opportunity out there because I think it's wide open running. But I don't think we should necessarily narrowly cast this as the digital divide.
Well, the other one I was going to mention is blackelectorate.net, which has links to lots of different stories.
But it's not an original content site. I mean, remember what Sumner Redstone said, content is king. You know, those sites are sort of sites that you link to other information, which is a valuable service. But I'm talking about sites that provide first source original content that's catered to specific audiences. They're far and few between right now, not only the black community, Latino community also. So I think that even though we've cast this as a digital divide, I think there's a larger issue out there, but there's a tremendous opportunity out there right now.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about, too. I mean, the hallmark of the web is that there are really almost no barriers to entry. Anybody could actually go to a computer in a public library, and if you sat there long enough, you could make your own content, make your own website at no cost to you, and have it out for the whole world to see. Isn't that right?
You can have it out for the whole world to see, but you also have to have, if you're going to grow the site, there's one of the reasons why all of the network news sites are in such competition with each other. Tremendous marketing, tremendous dollars. They still haven't figured out the revenue model for online news sites. So while anyone can create a website, that doesn't necessarily mean that your website is going to be viewed by the larger public.
Okay. Andrew, what do you think of this? How do minority communities, do you think, stand as far as getting broadband access, getting into content?
Well, I think we have to step back and think a little bit about the environment and the foundation for all of this. The Republican Bush administration several years ago, through their Commerce Department, issued a report stating that 95% of all jobs in the 21st century would require computer skills. And over the last several years, as the internet has proliferated, there's been a lot of discussion about, is it because of the cost of the computer? Is it because of the cost of access? Technology keeps on changing and evolving. We've gone from dial-up to broadband access in people's homes and now Wi-Fi. A study just came out a couple of days ago that reiterated the U.S.'s poor position in the world, now ranked 20th in the country in broadband penetration. And the cost of access to the internet in certain major urban centers is somewhere in the area of $400, $500 a year. So, forgetting the cost of the computer, which is going down, there are a number of factors that are keeping the underserved communities from getting online and joining the opportunity that exists by using technology in a new way to either break the chains of social and economic inequity, to get the opinions out there, to change the political dynamics in order to support their goals. And that's why last year I ran what some people thought was a very narrow campaign focused on bringing Wi-Fi to New York. But frankly, in this country, 300 cities are building Wi-Fi networks, and New York City should be leading the nation in using new technology to create opportunities for its citizens. So as much as I agree with Walter that there is a limited amount of content, part of it is that there aren't enough people in those communities online creating content for their community. So it's a kind of a chicken and egg scenario here. It's very hard to build a business model in, whether it's news or community-based services online. But on the other hand, the technology is getting cheaper, easier to use, and we're going away from computers to handheld devices. Just to give you an example, they did a study a couple of years ago on cell phone use in New York, and the average penetration is about 81% of all New Yorkers have cell phones. So now, granted, there isn't great content on cell phones through the internet, but that's changing over time. So I think that we're moving there, but we have to keep putting a sort of a finger into the side of the political bureaucracy and help our old industrial economy city, New York, become a leading 21st century city and bring everybody along.
You're listening to 93.9 and AM 820 WNYC. I'm Errol Lewis of the New York Daily News, sitting in for Brian Lehrer. We're talking with Walter Fields of the Community Service Society and Andrew Rasiej, an entrepreneur and former candidate for public advocate. Andrew, if I understood your campaign plank last year, it was, in my mind, sort of comparing the information superhighway, or at least the Wi-Fi part of it, to the ordinary stone, steel, granite superhighway, something that individuals don't pay for, that the government does it, and then the added commerce and circulation is considered a general public good. 150
years ago, 1 out of every 10 New Yorkers was dying of diphtheria and other diseases because we didn't have fresh water, and the city embarked on what would be a $20 billion program to build the aqueduct system that delivered water to New York, and created, for a large degree, the infrastructure that allowed New York to become the leading city of the industrialized world. We're at a similar juncture today, and I think that if we wait for Verizon and Time Warner or other ISPs of the world to build that aqueduct system for the 21st century information highway, they're not going to invest in it. So it does require leadership on the part of the political system to recognize a need and to build that information superhighway for the future.
We can take calls on this. Are you someone who can't take advantage of the free wireless internet that's supposed to be out there as a public service? What do you think should happen? How much of a priority should citywide Wi-Fi be if so many people can't take advantage of it? Give us a call at 212-433-WNYC. That's 433-9692. And our email box is always open at brianlehrershow@wnyc.org. Walter Fields, what do you think the city should do at the same time it focuses on these initiatives like free Wi-Fi in the parks?
Well, I think there definitely should be public investment in the infrastructure, because I think you're absolutely right. If you look historically, when you had barriers to exist, it was oftentimes government intervention that lowered those barriers through investment. But I would also be careful to say that the cost is a prohibitive factor. Because one of the things that, I was amazed by several years ago, I attended the National Cable Show down in New Orleans. It's a cable industries convention. And the editor of Multi-Channel News stood up during a workshop on diversity and chastised the panel about this very issue, saying that if you looked at all the statistics, particularly for African Americans, they were the first users of most new technology and electronic gadgetry. So even though they may not spend $1,000 on a computer at the time, a computer and printer, they may spend it on something else. There's a choice issue here, and whether or not there is seen real value in having that computer in the home. Now, I think some of that is changing, and a lot of it's changing because of the issue of education and what we're going to have to do for the next generation to be prepared. So I think many black households and many poor households are beginning to understand the importance of the computer to their child's future. And I think in the long run, that's going to help many adults come online, because if your child needs it, if it's in the household, chances are you're going to begin to see the benefit of having it. So I think the city can do a couple of things. I think they can invest. I think they can invest in public education and make sure every child in the city is ready for the 21st century workforce, and that's going to include the notion of using electronic communications, online access as a tool. So I think the city has a lot of responsibility here. The problem is you don't have many people in the city really talking about it.
Well, I always like to say that a politician doesn't know the difference between a server and a waiter.
Right, but that's a real issue. You know, I listened to a discussion that was taped this morning as I saw a New York City Council hearing where someone was chastising the fact of having children come into schools with their own calculators. And I said, wait a minute, what are you talking about? And the whole concern was whether or not they would cheat because they had their own calculator. And it was the fault. Well, the narrowness of that perspective, I think, is why we're here today.
You know, I was just going to add to that, which is that there's a romanticized view of education of the kid with the books over his shoulder, going in with the teacher at the front of the class, delivering the information out of a textbook and then testing on the basis of memorization of the information in the textbook. And the reality of it is that the skill set that needs to be taught today is navigating these massive information networks and pulling out the information you need when you need it.
That's right.
And that's a different skill set. And the political system and the bureaucracies and the unions that have built up our education system over the last 300 or 400 years, the Prussian education system, are failing to recognize the opportunities of the digital future.
Walter Fields, can you wrap this up as a poverty issue? I mean, your mandate at the Community Service Society is to work on issues of poverty. As I have often written, the predecessor organization, before it was named the Community Service Society, it was called the New York Association for the Improvement of Conditions of the Poor. How does this fit into that mandate?
Well, I think the bridge out of poverty is really this digital highway. And that if you begin to look at the 21st century economy, if you don't construct that bridge to give people the opportunity to access new opportunities in this new workforce, then you're going to continue to have persistent poverty in our city among this population. So we have to make sure that we do have widespread access to the net. We have to make sure that internet access becomes ubiquitous across platforms. We have to make sure that this population understands that for their children, it becomes critical that they become literate in this new technology environment.
Paul from the Bronx, you're on the air. Good morning.
Hi. I actually work in Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx, which is a very, very heavily wooded park. And we recently found out that we're going to be one of the places where the internet is going to be put into the park. One of the things I found out is the location where it's going to be put is not going to give the kind of, I guess, wide open access to as many people to use the park as possible. But more importantly, there's so many other issues within the parks where I guess the cost of this technology could go toward something else. Does anybody know why this was such a priority? Just let me say, I went to Philadelphia recently, and it was wonderful. I could sit almost anywhere and open up my laptop and find out. We were down there touring with my kids and find out different locations and things to do.
So, Paul, before I ask one of my guests to respond to that, you liked having the access in the parks in Philadelphia?
It wasn't in the parks. It was just about anywhere. I mean, you could go in our hotel room. We could just open up the computer. When we were in I guess it's Market Square, where there's a big market in Philadelphia. We could just open up our computer and just kind of go ahead and use the computer. But more importantly, I guess that was because the signal was strong throughout the city. I thought that was great. But in terms of the overall cost here in New York City, Parks is one of the most underfunded agencies within the city. And
okay, I think we get it. I hear what you're saying about the access would be good, the cost might be questionable or prohibitive. So, Andrew.
So, first of all, I don't believe the New York City Parks Department is actually spending money on this. This was an effort, a public-private partnership between a company that was willing to provide the access through sponsors and other organizations to provide this access through the parks. And the parks are just the tip of the iceberg for the effort to try to bring wireless throughout New York. And Philadelphia had a visionary CTO and a mayor who announced that they were going to make the entire city Wi-Fi. And other cities around the country are doing it. And in New York, although from a policy perspective the city hasn't embraced it, people like Elliot Spitzer have recently come out and said that this needs to be looked at seriously. In fact, I can say my campaign was a success because the New York Times editorial board chimed in about 6 weeks ago with an editorial saying that New York should go Wi-Fi. And another reason I think my campaign was a success was that I was introduced to a company called Phone, F-O-N, which started a service about 3 months ago, which allows people to share their Wi-Fi access. In fact, there is already a de facto wireless internet system in New York through the distribution of cable modems and DSL modems, and most of those are locked down. Phone allows people to open them up in a secure way and share their Wi-Fi, and then when they travel around the city, they can connect anywhere. So even though I appreciate the caller's concern about the cost being going into the park, this is moving very, very quickly. We're going to look at the open spaces as being a place where we can easily provide access, and it's going to start trickling into the fabric of the city overall. Whether it be public supported or privately supported, the business models for this are starting to turn in our favor.
I'm Errol Lewis of the Daily News, sitting in for Brian Lehrer. We're talking with Walter Fields of the Community Service Society and Andrew Rasiej, entrepreneur and former candidate for public advocate. Do you foresee, Andrew, a reaction from the companies that currently charge $400 to $500 a year for wireless internet?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's one of the big issues is that there's a de facto duopoly in New York. There's only two major providers, Verizon and Time Warner, and so one of the reasons why the wireless is interesting is because it allows for other companies to provide services at a lower cost. And one of the misnomers is that there's some people advocating for free wireless, and just like water isn't free and electricity isn't free, it's a utility. So should we be paying $40 or $50 a month to access broadband at a rate that's half as fast or a quarter as fast as what's available in other countries like Korea or in Europe? No. And one of the, going back to what Walter mentioned earlier, is that the political system doesn't really understand this, and the political system doesn't have a regulatory structure in place to force the franchise agreements that they've signed with Time Warner and Verizon to make sure that the cost is reasonable and accessible to all New Yorkers.
And that's a really important point, because the issue of competition in this environment, if you go back to the 96 Telecom Act, which was supposed to spur competition, it's had almost the exact opposite effect. So now you find in most major urban areas you have one major cable provider and a major local telephone provider.
Okay, that's where we're going to have to leave it. I would like to thank my guest, Walter Fields, Vice President of Political Development at the Community Service Society, Andrew Rasiej, former candidate for public advocate and an internet entrepreneur. Thank you for coming on, and I'm sure we will revisit this issue in the future.
Thank you.